Welcome to the 18th Annual Southwestern Rail Conference, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you. My name is Terry Canales, and last year it was an honor to be reappointed by Speaker Dave Phelan to serve as the chair of the House Committee on Transportation for the second consecutive session. As you know, the 87th legislative session wrapped up almost a year ago in May 2021, and we had one heck of a transportation session. We passed transportation legislation that covers the full spectrum of transportation issues, including issues addressing our seaports, railroad, golf carts, airport police, the definition of a bicycle transportation funding, you name it. So among the bills signed into law I'd like to talk to you about is, and it may be useful to the railroad community, is House Bill 2219. It reauthorized the Texas Department of Transportation to utilize the Texas Mobility Fund. The Mobility Fund's a revolving fund that was approved by the voters in 2001, and it's considered to be one of the most flexible transportation funding tools the state has ever had. While approximately 97% of the transportation funding in Texas is dedicated to the construction and maintenance of the state highway system, the Texas Mobility Fund is one of the unique tools that can be used to fund highways, both tolled and non-tolled, passenger rail, transit, aviation, and our ports. In 2015, the legislature decided to suspend that revolving fund, but last session we reauthorized TxDOT to bond again between $2 to $3 billion for a limited amount of time. Now I'm sharing this with you to ensure folks know that Texas now has this funding tool at its disposal to use on passenger rail. So if there's anyone out there in the audience working on passenger rail, you should look at this tool. It might be helpful to you. So it's no secret that while Texas Department of Transportation has a top-tier rail division that focuses on planning and safety, the state spends almost no revenue on passenger or freight rail. Meanwhile, Texas ranks first in the U.S. in terms of number of rail miles by state, second in the nation for terms of number of railroad companies operating in their state, and Texas is home to 10,539 track miles and 52 freight rail operators. The Union Pacific Railroad and the BNSF Railway, the two largest rail carriers in the state, operate 11,292 rail miles, which is 76% of the total miles, and the Kansas City Southern, the third Class 1 railroad in the state of Texas, operates 929 rail miles. Short-line railroads operate the remaining 2,550 miles of rail line in the state of Texas. And by 2050, freight rail and tonnage in Texas is expected to increase by 105%, which represents an annual growth rate of 2.3% over the next 32 years. Texas also has 6 binational freight rail crossings between Texas and Mexico. And in 2018, the Texas movements totaled nearly 325 million tons, or 405 in cargo value. By 2050, rail movements are anticipated to total 786 million tons, or 1.3 trillion in value. So currently, rail accounts for about 2.5 billion in tax revenue for the state. So all of this data I've shared with you is to point out how powerful our railroad industry is in Texas and to our economy, and to highlight how simultaneously strange it is that Texas does not do more for us to support the rail industry. So this coming session, I'd like to change that. A few months ago, the Speaker of the House was reported to have called for an infrastructure session. Now, I know his staff and I are working on that. It's my job as the chairman of the Transportation Committee to advocate for new investments in Texas. And this could be the best time to rally the railroad advocates. So I will be working with the Speaker and my fellow House members to advocate for solutions to make sure goods and people flow efficiently through our state and the corridors, including supporting initiatives like getting the first appropriations into the Texas Rail Relocation and Improvement Fund. Now, the fund was authorized to receive proceeds from the bonds as well as appropriations made by the legislature for financing reallocation and improvement of the privately and publicly owned rail facilities in order to relieve highway congestion, which we know we have a lot of, enhance public safety, improve air quality, and expand the economic opportunity. The fund may also be used for construction of railroad underpasses and overpasses if related to the relocation of a rail facility. The fund was approved by Texas voters over a decade ago and has sat idle, unused since its time. And it's time for Texas to fund it and better support the industry. We have the mechanism, now let's use it. So you don't need me to remind you that last year, Congress and the President Biden delivered a once-in-a-lifetime generation infrastructure investment under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And in that, I was pleased to see extraordinary financial support for the rail industry. Without getting into the details of the legislation, I'll just say that these investments were severely needed, and I'm proud that Congress finally put their money where their mouth is. There's one major obstacle that we need to address in this. If Texas wants to compete for a lot of the freight and passenger rail project funds, it will likely need a state match of at least 20%, which could be an issue. This particular problem is another reason why I would like to encourage all the Texas rail advocates to stay involved in the appropriation process next session to get rail funds allocated. It's also great to see that Amtrak has had a significant boost in federal funding, and I'd like to see some of that spent in Texas. Amtrak has a 15-year vision for extending service to 160 additional communities in and around the Texas Triangle, Austin, Dallas, and Houston. And I'd like to see some of the funding be used for passenger rail, service down to the Rio Grande Valley or Laredo, where I live. Congressman Cuellar and I have spoken about this, and I hope our conversations with Amtrak lead to positive developments. Right now, Mexico is studying passenger rail service from Monterrey to San Antonio, and Texas is lagging behind in all these aspects. The last thing I want to mention are that the interim charges we received a couple of weeks ago from the Speaker. For those who are unaware of interim charges, after each Texas legislative session, it is the practice of the Speaker of the House of Representatives to assign each committee a list of issues to study between the legislative sessions. So typically, committees will study their interim charges by holding committee hearings with the invited experts to discuss data, facts, and solutions regarding the topics of the hearing. The interim charges this round are an excellent variety of top issues we need to address in transportation. Our committee charges include temporary license plates, electric vehicles, seaports, future transportation needs, and others. I believe one particular charge that certainly applies to our railroad advocates is the charge on the state's future transportation needs. Here's part of the language of the charge so you understand. Study the current and future transportation needs and consider improvements to ensure that Texas is adequately planning for the state's population growth forecasts. When we have our hearing on this charge, I welcome your expertise into the conversation and to help educate the committee on the current and future needs of rail transportation. With our population growth set to almost double by 2050, rail is going to become increasingly important for the movement of freight and passengers. So to wrap it up, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to share my thoughts, and I look forward to seeing you at our committee hearings. And this interim, I look forward to seeing you at those interim hearings. As always, please know that my office door is always open to each of you if I can ever be helpful. So thank you, travel safely, and may God bless you.